Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on journalism as an industry, which is facing so many challenges, both in terms of credibility and trust, as well as long-term structural changes brought about by different revenue models, and also the increasing competition from social media and the fragmentation of the media landscape. And my guest to discuss these issues is Neil Brown. He is the president of the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, which is a nonprofit journalism school and research organization located in the United States. And Neil has over 4 decades of experience as a journalist, having formerly been the editor of the St. Petersburg Times, or now the Tampa Bay Times. He's been a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board for 9 years, and in 2007 launched the website politifact.com, which is a fact-checking website of political leader statements that some of you may be familiar with. So Neil has a breadth of experience in the field of journalism, and I thought to talk with him about some of the common themes that in particular academics talk about in terms of concepts like media trust or theories of mediatization, which is the idea that the media has become more sensationalist over time. And of course, I wanted to ask him about what he thinks about the role of social media in contributing to some of the problems that we see with journalism today. And to be fair, I was planning to do this episode on AI and journalism, but as I heard more of what Neil has been talking about on other podcasts, I thought that would be a missed opportunity to focus on something so narrow rather than more fundamental and long-term issues that are facing the field of journalism. So we'll start off by talking about the concept of media trust, which, spoiler, Neil doesn't think is a very good concept at all. We'll talk about some of the challenges facing the local news industry and some of the solutions that are currently being implemented, particularly in the United States. And then we'll move into a discussion of fact-checking and different models of fact-checking. And in particular, I was interested to find out what Neil thinks about Meta and their shutting down of their fact-checking program and switching more to a community notes or crowdsourcing model of fact-checking. And the Poynter Institute has been very involved with Meta and their fact-checking program. So Neil's perfectly positioned to talk about this. And then, yes, at the very end, we will touch a little bit on AI. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Neil Brown. Again, he is the president of the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. Neil, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks, Michael. Good to be with you.
So to start out here, I thought we could start with a discussion of media trust. And surveys in both Europe and the United States, and probably elsewhere as well, tend to show a declining trend in media trust. And I know you've discussed the idea of brands as a concept for journalism. So I'd like to ask, what do you think explains this long-term decline in media trust? Is it the brands of individual outlets, the collective brand of journalism, if we can talk about it like that, or something outside of journalism entirely?
So like with every good question, like the one you just posed, the answer is all of the above. It's a very complex dynamic, and the world of information and information integrity and journalism and independent journalism is just constantly in flux and changing. And that's okay. That's natural. And I think we have to respond to it. So I'm going to start my real answer, Michael, by saying to some degree, I take issue with even the phrase media and trust or media trust. And why I say that is that I think the word media itself is overly broad and unspecific. And I think we have kind of been swept up in kind of depends on what the audience thinks when they think about media. There are so many forms, everything from local to national to various platforms and forms of delivery. So media is a really overly broad term. And then I'm going to expand that and say, I think trust itself is an overly broad term. what you trust, what you believe, what you agree with. Depending on who you're asking and the background of the individuals, these things can have different meanings. And yet we conflate both of the words individually and the words together. But I do think these macro terms are partly where we all get kind of hung up, when in fact, for each of us as individuals or in our communities, how we consume information, what we think about journalism, whether it be institutional brands or individuals that you go to for information, all of these things have a very specific and to some degree individual character. And I think we kind of, as an industry, I say industry meaning media and journalism, I think we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice when we kind of mash all these up into one big thing. All right. So, with that big overview, I'll try to come at your question more specifically. There's an amazing paradox in the world of journalism, right? Which is that things are now so fragmented thanks to technology and thanks to the different forms of journalism. And even though there's a bit of a common belief that there are fewer journalists and fewer journalism organizations and that it's an industry, something in even retreat, even as those things have a reality to them, we may have more eyeballs than ever on the journalism. There may be more information at our disposal than ever before. So fragmented, it's something smaller. Collectively, the interest and the opportunity to get information is like profoundly more vast. So you have this kind of tension. And I think that tension has led to a convenient and maybe understandable sense that, well, since there's so many options, so many choices, I don't know what to believe anymore. And so my trust is down. And so then we get into the question you're asking about brands. So it may be down in specific brands that I used to rely on. It may be down in certain individuals who are no longer doing the work of journalism or offering independent information. The fact that I can hear from my relatives through a text message or a social media post, and now I have five more sources than I had before. They don't happen to be journalists, they happen to be my relatives or something, but now I have all these choices. And that leads to this sort of sense of I don't know what to believe, hence, I don't know necessarily what to trust. And all of that rolls into a complex situation. And so, brands that you could go to because they were simple, they were prominent, they had a history, those have lost some of their audience. Those have lost some of their appeal. Maybe it's important to understand that some of that loss comes with time. Things have to change. And we need to adapt to that. And as an industry, journalism has never really been super swift at adaptation. It's sort of rode its laurels a little bit for a while. So that puts a challenge on any individual brand, be it an institution or an individual, to kind of recommit to the audience to show you why my brand or my information, whatever it may be, has value to you. And I think that is a new dynamic that journalism institutions have to adapt to or have to accept, I guess I should say. And to some degree, if you take your own brand for granted, you do that at your own peril because people have so many choices. So I think brands do matter. I think brands continue to have power in this journalism world and in the information ecosystem. But it is now incumbent, given the marketplace of opportunities, that every brand commit to constantly establishing itself or explaining to its audience why I have value for you or why it has value for you, rather than just assume because it's a brand and you know me, you love me.
Right. But I'd like to return to what you were talking about at the start of your answer there about these broad concepts of media trust and then media trust, because you're talking to a large audience of academics who are very interested in concepts, or at least I am. And so I think I'm curious to hear about trust specifically, because I can certainly buy how there's different types of media. And we see that from different formats, different types of ownership models, what have you. But what about trust? It is very hard to capture, but how else could we describe it in a way that would be more accurate in your view?
So I really appreciate that question because I think this is the next lane of a lot of conversation in the media space because trust has been such an absolute, sort of benchmark for credibility. And certainly when we talk about trust, certain concepts absolutely hold up for sure. Trust should be something that's not deceptive, that is transparent about where information comes from or why the case we're making can be believed. I'm a very big believer that anonymous sources have been a problem in the journalism world and have eroded trust. Certainly, trust and credibility go to what I would call the relationship between those offering information, whether it's journalism or an academic, whatever, showing where they get the information and then building a relationship with the recipient, with the audience, so that trust is essentially not unilateral, but a bilateral relationship. Why I wanted to include trust in that first part of the answer is, at least in the journalism space, I also think it's becoming a little bit of a convenient trope to say this is what's wrong, people don't trust you. And I think that represents a shorthand that has a little bit of potential laziness in it, even for journalists who use it as a mantra. And so, why do I say that? Because, for instance, I do believe that for some people, trust, appropriate or not, equates with, do I agree with it? Not is it credible, but do I agree with it? Particularly in this information ecosystem right now, where you have so many options and you can pretty much find any kind of source of information that agrees with your own predisposition or prevailing view. And so, is that trust? Well, sure. I mean, obviously, the audience member gets to decide what they trust and what they don't trust. But I think when we say things like trust is at an all time low, well, if the definition of trust is I have to agree with it, and that's at an all time low, possibly. But if trust is to suggest that we want to be able to have a civil discourse with disagreement, which I'm afraid, unfortunately, is not always the environment we're in these days, well, then I'm not sure trust is a single unifying point. I heard Mark Thompson, who I think is the CEO of CNN, he had a good answer to this. He said, I'm not sure I'm expecting my audience to be unskeptical and agree with everything that we do at CNN. And I admire the answer because I don't think that necessarily means they don't trust it. They just come at it as a discerning consumer. And so I would prefer, or at least I'm going to be on my own hobby horse a little bit to get the folks in our journalism world to sort of take a richer definition of trust, to say, do I have an ongoing relationship where I can go to you whether I agree with you or not, where I will check out what you have to offer, whether I agree with you or not, whether from a standpoint of the journalist or the journalism or the news organization, where they have shown their math, shown the sources of their information, whether they have been inclusive in rounding out full stories, whether they are open to people taking exception, whether they correct any mistakes. It's a human process, there's going to be mistakes. And all of those things should roll up to trust. But I believe that the macro surveys that ask the question don't go into any of those level of details. It's just a gut check. And when it comes to gut check, I think, well, sure, I don't want to pretend that numbers that are down are time for celebration by any means, but I think they only go so far.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the primary ways to study trust from an academic perspective is just to ask people, how much do you trust the media? And then it's up to the respondent to actually fill in what they mean. And as you said, that could be just agreement, and maybe why we see such large partisan differences in how Republicans and Democrats fill in what they mean by media trust.
I agree with that totally. And I also think, though, that this sounds like I'd be the last person to sort of go for killing the messenger, but I think we've been asking now this question a lot in the last several years, to the point that it becomes, as I said, a bit of a shorthand for a non-rigorous conversation about it. The business has come up with trust indices and different sort of tactics to win trust. But there's an element of committing a sin in journalism, which is to tell, not show. And I do think that we need to be showing more specifically what we mean when we ask the question, and show more specifically what we're getting back in terms of the answer.
Yeah, super interesting. And maybe we can come back to this idea of concepts when we get to facts and fact checking. But Because you have so many decades in the field of journalism and because the audience here is quite academic, I thought to ask, apropos simplicity, about some theories or general statements that academics use to conceptualize particularly the relationship between media and politics. And sort of going back to the network legacy media days, there's this idea that over time, because of the advertising models of journalism, that there's been this kind of reinforcing spiral between sensationalist or controversial media coverage and then politicians adapting their rhetoric to be more and more controversial and negative to attract media attention. And so we call those theories of mediatization or the negativity bias. And I'm curious if you think if that's an accurate description, or how would you interpret the relationship between media and journalism over time?
So I think there's a couple of key changes to some degree in the journalism business model that I think you're alluding to in part. One is, in fact, for the longest time, it was such an advertising driven business. Advertising threw off big, big dollars, which subsidized and paid for some really great and important work separately. And in fact, the irony, since we talk about, sort of the tense environment and political environment, is that, in a very legacy media time, over recent decades, actually advertisers preferred that information be super credible, super relevant, no matter whether it was popular or not, because they knew that the notion of independent, quality information attracted eyeballs, particularly eyeballs of people who might be educated, have income, and who the advertisers wanted to reach. So the irony is that while there's sort of kind of a sort of generic lore that advertisers want to always influence the journalistic content, generally speaking it was not the case. They actually felt that it was the more credibility and independence the organization had, the bigger the audience it would get, and the advertisers wanted to reach the biggest possible audience. So what has changed a lot in the last really generation pretty much is that back to that fragmentation of audience, and that the idea of a centralized big audience is gone by the boards, and so with it has gone that advertising support, at least at scale, in a lot of ways. And so what has not replaced it, but what has become a much more significant component has been reader or audience revenue, where just like all our streaming services and things like that, membership campaigns at public media, subscription models, you name it, the reader, audience member, viewer, listener pays directly for the content. The advertiser doesn't. Now, again, I want to be clear, advertising remains a major component still. But that fragmentation is what has created a lot of the challenge here, because now it's not a matter of a single audience at scale. It's, can you amass a series of audiences, because each of them are more than they have been in the past, their own revenue lane. And as a result of that, that certainly incentivizes more and more people to go after large, big audiences. The price point is actually cheaper and smaller, but you're collecting a lot of audiences to try to build up your volume. And that has had an absolutely profound and at times troubling and difficult effect on journalism, because to the point you made, Michael, attracting and maybe provoking audience interest, and I did use the word provoking on purpose, through provocative content, in some cases content that's not accurate, but certainly is sensational in a lot of ways. This is by no means the only way to attract audiences, but it is an effective way. And with that has followed a fair bit of revenue. And that has unfortunately compounded that fragmentation challenge, right? So now revenue and audience, eyeballs, however you define that, kind of all flow together. And as a result, there's a lot of information out there that's not very good, but is very lucrative.
Absolutely. And so I wonder about the role of social media platforms here, because, of course, they contribute to this digital fragmentation that kind of fractures the media landscape. But also, going back to what you were just saying, these are almost entirely advertisement driven services in the sense that they don't really have a subscription model except for maybe X. And so I'm wondering, how you see these more traditional or even upstart journalist outlets who are trying to cultivate a subscription based service, but then they have these huge major tech companies that are purely advertisement driven, and much of their content is coming from news sources. So I guess my question is, how do you see that, where perhaps the revenue model of journalism is trying to be more subscription, but then they're also in the same environment with these massive tech companies that are aggregating news, but it's almost completely driven by advertisements?
Yeah, I mean, what you've described, I think, I don't mean to get technical on you, but would be described as a hot mess. So, no, listen, I would say one of the important things for all of us to constantly remind ourselves about is it's not one thing only, right? So even as you described, the big tech platforms and social media work as very advertising driven. Of course, they're making billions and billions through advertising, but it is an ultimately also a distribution model, and they distribute lots and lots of content. I think for us in the journalism world, a lot of times they are distributing, essentially they are the main distributor of content that they didn't pay for, so they get the benefit of both the advertising and the distribution without actually having to have bankroll the very content that they're passing on. That's a ongoing. That's a whole business. You could do a degree in that alone. But I do think that rather than lament, it's one, it's the other, it's all of it. I think this goes back to the question of adaptation. So, how do you reach people? Certainly, social media has been an amazingly powerful tool to reach people and to connect people. I really believe that we should lead more than lament at this point, because these are all really powerful realities. The technology turned out to be more powerful, both in speed and in reach, than we could have imagined. And so the key should be, what can we create that works within it, rather than, we're not going back to a different time. So I think, as I said, that's that paradox I was referring to. Suddenly I got a lot more eyes on the journalism. Unfortunately, I don't have the dollars to support it as much as I wish I had. But that level of reach is real. And so while there's certainly tons of misinformation and disinformation, there's also the ability for very important information and value to reach audiences through these powerful platforms. We wish it was simpler, but it's not. But I think that we need to be willing to figure out how to connect directly with our audiences, both on these platforms and not exclusively on these platforms. We need to make sure and believe in the quality of journalism and quality information has an audience and has a value for people, that we have a story to tell around it so that we can show what that value is. And again, I don't mean to sound like a Pollyanna or be naive about the challenges, but if we are mired only in the trappings of it, I think that will come at the expense of coming up with products, information, journalism that actually would hold some value for people. And that's where we ought to be focusing our efforts.
Absolutely. And so I'm a little bit sheepish to ask my next question, which is exactly about mis and disinformation, just because it's so top of mind, especially in the discourse of policymakers. I mean, disinformation is consistently seen as one of the major threats to democracy. But I guess maybe there's a silver lining in that it may create more demand for quality information, as you were saying. But I'd like to get your thoughts on this rhetoric of disinformation as one of society's biggest problems. I mean, do you think that the attention and resources that are devoted to countering disinformation is proportionate to its effects on journalism and society?
Well, absolutely not. But I think that's beyond us in that sense. So certainly, I mean, there's studies that talented academics have put forth, and scientists, computer scientists, social scientists know misinformation, disinformation travels faster than the truth in many, many ways. And as I mentioned, there's some economic incentives for that to happen, but there's no real reversing of that. So I go back to, let's create, not convert, meaning I'm not worried about totally converting some big platforms into not spreading mis or disinformation. Hopefully they have some accountability built in, and various safety divisions and all are working on all of that. But I think it's not about one or the other because I tend to believe that, listen, journalism remains an important component of democratic societies, which is the belief that independent, fact based, evidence based, whatever words you like, expression are part of what makes a democracy work. And I think our goal needs to be starting very much where I think it's the strongest at the local level and then working out from there. We have something to offer and to provide. And thinking about what you have to offer and to provide is, I think, a healthier and probably more productive way than think you're going to stop something that's particularly bad. Disinformation, let me be clear, it's toxic. It hurts people. We saw it during COVID. We see it in politics in a number of societies. Propaganda, by the way, misinformation, disinformation, not new at all. Certainly the speed of it and the possibility of the technology to reach more people has changed that dynamic. But this is not a new phenomenon, even close. But I think the reality is that we need to produce good, strong, service-oriented, valuable information so that people find it to be a service. And I know you want to ask me about fact checking in a minute. We'll get into that, but I do believe that ultimately people are interested in tools, information, journalism, some sense of independence around it, or certainly nonpartisan information that they will altogether find useful and relevant to their daily lives. Part of the understandable, but almost to some degree sad reality is that this entire conversation tends to be framed in a political, through a political lens or through a political prism. Certainly, in democratic societies, information guided us on how to vote, information guided us on where to vote, information guided us on how our government officials or the people in power are doing their job. So I'm not naive about why so much of that is politics or politically oriented. But the truth is, information as a resource in participating in a democratic society or in self government isn't just about politics. And certainly in the States, everything has become blue versus red, Fox versus MSNBC. These are very narrow macro lanes. They're real, they're powerful, but they're not the only lanes. And so I think increasingly, I bring up local news where a lot of my career was in, is that day in and day out, providing information. It could be about restaurants, it could be about business, it could be about certainly health. These were things that are, not just were, valuable for local citizens to exercise their muscles in receiving information, being consumers of information. And a lot of that still obtains. And so information, disinformation, these are, again, pretty big concepts. It's not that they're not real, but I think the closer we can get back, be more organic and on the ground with people, I think we can continue to show how quality information has value in their lives. One more point about that. There is a growing body of work. Pointer is involved doing a lot of it right now, as a number of other organizations, on what gets called media literacy, news literacy. And I don't want to diminish terms like that because we're part of it as jargon. But the reality is what's underlying that work, which we're very proud of, and again, many organizations are doing it, the more we can give the consumer of information, the recipient, the audience member, whatever words you like in that regard, the power to use information and judge it for themselves without being told what it needs to be or this or that, the better I think society will be. And that's, I think, a more organic way to approach this.
100%. And it's refreshing to talk to someone who, yeah, looks at these concepts of disinformation and also media literacy with a bit of a critical eye. But I'd like to push you a little bit on your answer there, because really from my own lack of knowledge on what's going on in the local journalism front, I mean, it seems to me like you're saying that there is this huge, or at least an increasing demand for this quality news or stories that directly impact people's lives, empower them at the local level. But then my question would be, why do local news outlets struggle? It seems like there's so many that are closing down. Is that a mismatch in the models? Is it people just are unwilling to pay, or why isn't local news I mean, I don't know if it's on the rise. I know COVID had a bit of a bump for local news, but why isn't it sort of taking over and sort of upending these more national outlets in your view?
So it's a totally fair question, and your description of the circumstances is accurate. I think it remains a situation in transition, first and foremost for the economic challenges I mentioned before. So the New York Times can scale up its digital transformation, its digital subscriptions because they have Wirecutter, they have Wordle, they have the spelling bee, as well as the terrific journalism, and because it's on a national level and they're well, international really, and they are attracting customers at a pretty respectable price point from such a major pool as the largest news organization, certainly in the US and maybe in the West, anyways. It works for them. Tougher on a local level. So the answer to your question is I think there has been a shakeout in terms of the business models because of that shift from advertising, which used to sustain local news, to membership, subscription, and reader revenue models, which don't have the same revenue volumes or price points that the advertising world have. So we're in transition there. I do see things trending back up in part because of it used to be either advertising or subscriptions. Now there's a third leg to the local news economics model, the third leg of the stool, and that is philanthropy. And so what you're seeing in a number of organizations, certainly while continues to be a consolidation of local news organizations, which, by the way, is code for a number of them have gone out of business. I get it. But there is now an uptick as they're often smaller organizations that are serving smaller geographies and communities, but not irrelevantly small by any means. I mean, they're smaller, and they are being funded through philanthropy, membership, grants, and foundations, along with advertising and subscriptions. So you have, as I say, three legs of the stool, whereas before it was kind of two. So I think if you look at it on a much more local and probably smaller scale level, you are seeing a coming back on the local news front. Doesn't mean it's not deeply challenging still, but that's why I have some sense of the marketplace responding, because the work at that level, it's not red or blue. It's all about, hey, do you think my taxes or my water bill is going up this week, or what's going to happen? Now, it may have national implications with things like policies at school boards or tariffs or things like that. So it's not that these things are unrelated, but I do believe in a sort of consumer service focused news at a local level. And over time, it won't have the scale of the big national brands, but it will serve communities, and hopefully funders at a local level, community level, as well as advertisers and readers will support that. I should say, by the way, and it's not all digital because a lot of community weeklies continue to actually do pretty well in the US at a local level. But so that's why I think the narrative of local news is threatened. It has been, it is. Hard stop. But that said, that is not the full story. The full story includes that there are increasingly community, smaller news outlets that are serving smaller geographies or thematic, maybe groups of people. And they are finding that if they provide that service we were talking about earlier, they will find an audience. And what we see here, then, long answer to your question is, I think we're still in transition as local news comes up with some new forms and approaches.
And would you say that that philanthropy model is sustainable if local news outlets are relying on donations essentially? I mean, is it that these grants are trying to help these local news outlets get through this transition period to sort of develop services similar to, let's say, Wordle or whatever? Or is it a fully dependent model on charity? Because that doesn't seem to be quite a long-term solution. Or how do you see it?
No, I think I agree with you there. Let me be clear. Philanthropy is not a panacea. It can, however, provide the investment wherewithal to uh, basically create the infrastructure, could be technologically speaking, could be product based, so that some of these organizations get at least a running start to see if they can serve the marketplace. So, in a lot of cases, we're seeing in the States a lot of grants from organizations like the Knight Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, American Journalism Project. They're setting up local news organizations with sort of a runway of 3 to 5 years. But then, to your point, Michael, the marketplace will vote, right? So you, in that time, you better find a way, whether it's a series of niche products, an approach to publishing, broadcasting, whatever it may be, that you can provide that very value I mentioned. Otherwise, yep, you should go away. I mean, nobody should pay, whether it's a membership, a subscription, or an advertiser, for something that they don't find value in. Hopefully, philanthropy basically creates that level of initial investment that a number of small organizations and even some medium ones just don't have the wherewithal to do. But the marketplace will get to vote, and you need to provide that level of service and value for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it's a super interesting space. So I wanted to pick your brain about it. But I do also want to pick your brain about PolitiFact because that's just a super cool project that I think has very high relevance to listeners of this podcast. So I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with politifact.com. But could you tell us a little bit about the rationale behind developing PolitiFact and how its work has changed as the digital technologies, media landscape, fragmentation has also changed since you first launched it?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for asking. PolitiFact is a passion project near and dear to my heart. We were there at the beginning. It actually started when I was at the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times newspaper, which Pointer owns, but it was a sort of a separate division. And the funny thing about PolitiFact is we started it in 2007 when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were running for president, and we thought it would be a 3-month project just to do something that journalism needs to do. I referenced this earlier. We needed to adapt and do something new, and we were looking for a web-first product, something digital. And instead, we were guilty, just like a lot of news organizations. Instead of covering the political campaigns with the same group of stories and the same 10 reporters all doing the same stories across organizations, we said, what if we simply just devoted resource to fact checking what the politicians say and then providing it in a much more consumer focused sort of way. In fact, we said it should be like the Consumer Reports for political speech. Like, I just want to look up, like I'm buying a dryer or I'm buying I'm going to elect an office holder. Like, I wonder who's got the quality information. And we said, let's try that for a few months. And then when the primaries in Florida are over, we'll go back to doing it the usual way. Well, it was such a resounding hit with the audience. Ironically, though, I'm telling you straight up, it's really no different than any other reporting, but we definitely put ourselves in the shoes of an audience member and said, how will this be of more utility to you, use to you, than our journalistic conventions? The reporting wasn't novel, but the format was. We even came up with something called the Truthometer. Your audience members will know some of that, where we would rate political speech on a scale from everything from true to half true, mostly false, all the way to the most ridiculous pants on fire. And we acknowledged it was a gimmick, except for this reality. We showed our sources. You will never find an anonymous source on PolitiFact. We basically said you ultimately, the audience member, can be the jury yourself and decide your own rating, what you believe. Once we show you our sources, we are not telling you what to believe. We're only telling you, here's what somebody said. We checked it out. Here's the sources we went to. We gave them a chance to explain why they said it the way they said it. We believe that words matter. I'm going to say that again. We do believe words matter. And now we think we provided something I said throughout this conversation, which is, we think, a service. And it has worked very well, and we were not the very first to ever do fact checking. Something called factcheck.org did it, but they tended to do it in a tad more expansive or explanatory way. And our Truthometer, for a lot of people, they kind of really like that gimmick. As I said, it is gimmick. It's a good gimmick. And again, it's an honorable one. So we thought it would go away, but after 3 months, the audience loved it. We ultimately received a Pulitzer Prize for the approach, which again, I think speaks to coming up with new and interesting forms to provide information. I think that's not irrelevant as we talk about social media platforms. Some of the influencers on social media, some of them are providing stories and news and information in very good and novel and compelling ways. And so we believe that adaptation is an important form of reaching people and getting them to find, again, a relationship with the material. So we're proud of PolitiFact. It's now gone from a handful of us in 2007 to we're in about 12 states. We are the largest political fact checking website in the country. We are constantly fact checking, hopefully at a local level, but certainly local, state, and of course, national level. The two most fact checked politicians in our time doing it are obviously Donald Trump and Barack Obama. So we again think that being consumer focused, audience focused is a good way for journalists to approach the work.
Absolutely. And I mean, as you mentioned, there was this kind of gimmicky element to it, but the principles behind it were quite, as we would think of traditional journalistic ethics, right? Being transparent, showing sources. And I'm curious about that in the context, there's been a lot of news, at least a couple of months ago, about Facebook removing its fact checking programs. And so I'm just curious about different types of fact checking models. Like there has been subcontracting out fact checkers, like I think Facebook did, to sort of partnering with established fact checking organizations, to now there's this new model of crowdsourcing fact checking through, for example, the community notes that we see on X. And I don't think that community notes model is coming from this type of trained journalist with these strong ethics. And so I'm just wondering how you see these different models of fact checking with social media. Was that type of ethics that you were alluding to, the transparency and that audience in mind for them to make up their own decisions, was that what was missing with that? Or how do you see these different approaches towards fact checking, particularly when it comes to these various models that social media companies have been trying out?
Sure. So PolitiFact was part of that third-party fact-checking program that Meta has just recently discontinued. We're disappointed by it, but obviously it's Mark Zuckerberg's company. He can do what he wants. What we didn't appreciate, and he was completely false, was accusing us of bias or censorship. We did nothing like that. We never could take down. We didn't have the power to take down any posts, no matter how false or crazy they were. We simply fact-checked material that was on Meta, gave you our rulings, transparent about what it was, and then Facebook decided to do whatever it wanted to do with them. But there was a blowback because people who were posting false things would suddenly find their posts downgraded by virtue of that information. And in some cases, that cost people money and they didn't like it. But in any event, that was a good way, I think, that Meta, to its credit for 8 years, actually did support fact checking and try to bring some accountability to its platform. Yes, I mean, you've raised the question of community notes. That's the program they're going to now, a lot of crowdsourcing of that. It's very common. We can all hold up our phone and say, unlike, 20 years ago, where you had to have a printing press or a broadcast license to publish or to broadcast, now anybody with a phone is a publisher. Well, that's probably true. Anybody with a phone can post anything and publish anything, but anybody with a phone is not a journalist. And that's the difference, which is independent review that sort of hews to at least a level of accepted best practices in terms of nonpartisanship, getting multiple sides of stories. And let me be clear, every story has multiple sides. Don't even bother with both sides, multiple sides, showing our sources, transparency. Those things I don't think are guaranteed with something like a community notes or a crowdsourcing model. I say that carefully because some of it's still being tested. And I don't think that a reflexive, if it's not our way, it must be a bad way. I think we can try some things. With PolitiFact, we never allowed even comments on our stories, which in the news industry was seen as crazy. You have to let people comment. But I said, well, since it's a fact-checking website, I can't allow comments where I can't be sure of the veracity of what the commenter says. So I don't think that that's the way we ought to play that. But my point ultimately is it's going to take a lot of different tries. Again, I think independent third party fact checking is a good way. I think one of the words we've used throughout this conversation is, in fact, independence. I think that kind of matters. Now, I recognize some people will have to decide for themselves what that means. So I'm not here to say community notes won't work. It's not the same as journalism. It's crowdsourcing. Who's going to check the crowdsourcers? I just don't believe in being super sanctimonious about any of it. So I think we have to try some new things. I do think technology will help. I think as you see more and more organizations experimenting with generative AI, I believe that there are great possibilities with AI, not just anxieties. We need to put up ethical guardrails. But some of this technology can work to our advantage when it's done honorably. And I think we should sort of get more and more technologists, journalists, academics, and other educators, artists together and see about trying some things that work rather than drawing sort of lines in the sand about any of it.
Well, that would be a great place to stop. But I have one more question for you, which is exactly about AI. I can't let you go without discussing today's biggest buzzword. But in particular, I mean, you know firsthand working with fact checking that with social media, because you have everyone who can publish some type of content, it may not exactly be journalism, but it can go out there and potentially be seen, that just the speed and the reach of content these days is, I mean, fact checking is resource intensive, right? It requires time and manpower that just is very difficult to keep up with the spread of all sorts of information. So, I mean, how do you see the types of generative tools coming out? Is there a sort of fact checking utility for them, or are they too dependent on old models to keep up with what's happening in the here and now?
No, I mean, listen, I think content generation still requires human beings. Even generative AI is essentially searching and scraping sources of information that was produced somewhere. Now, certainly, large language models are assembling things in ways that can even at times mask as original. But ultimately, I do believe feet on the street, reporters generating stories will be part of the component. And then these many AI tools that we will all experiment with, and we should. We just need to put up some guardrails, and we need to never deceive the audience as to what they're receiving. Nobody can defend deception, in my view, in that regard. Can then possibly give us opportunities to engage with people, to spend more time generating new and interesting content. And so, again, I don't mean to be a Pollyanna about the trappings and the risks of all of it. And frankly, when you talk about the one of the key components that got us to launch PolitiFact was, in fact, and this was now 2007, so that's what, 18 years ago, was in fact that it is so easy to make something look real that isn't, with an authority and a polish, thanks to technology, that isn't actually true or real. And we wanted to be able to combat that through, putting journalistic feet on the street. So again, I'm not naive about all the risks that go with it. But I do believe that if we set up some guardrails about how the technology is used, if we bring people together in terms of how can this advance our ability to be in some multiple places, to get records, to tell stories in visual and interesting ways, to actually answer reader questions that humans would put their name behind, right? That's ultimately the trust word that we talked about earlier. Accountability for it. That we can think about ways that this can work. Because I guarantee you, the idea of just crossing your arms and putting it up and stopping it, we've learned the hard way that is not going to work and doesn't really serve any of the audiences.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's naive to approach these topics that are so sensationalized in public discourse from a more measured and critical take. So, Neil, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Well, thanks for the conversation, Michael. It's been great fun and happy to do it again.
I've just been speaking with Neil Brown, president of the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next episode, I'll be speaking with Netta Kligler-Vilenchek and Yona Literat about their new book, Not Your Parents' Politics, Understanding Young People's Political Expression on Social Media. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.